Hi, everyone. I'm Joy Rosa with Earthworks Acupuncture, and we're here today with my very special guest, Dr. Parker T. Hurley. Parker holds a PhD in Educational Studies, concentration in Higher Education, and a Master's in Social Work, a social community organizer, and is a licensed clinical social worker and birth doula. Welcome, Parker.
Thanks for having me, Joy.
Can you introduce yourself a little further and kind of tell us where you're what your preferred pronouns are, where you're located globally and regionally, and ancestry
Sure.
lands that you're on.
So yeah, usually the first thing I lead with is that I'm queer. I'm a queer Black non-binary trans man, originally descending from New Jersey, with paternal lineage in Pennsylvania County, Virginia, and Henderson, North Carolina, which I did not know when I first came here to the South 11 years ago. So yeah, originally the land of the Eno and Okinichi people of the Saponi Nation. I know that you wanted that information as well.
Awesome. So can you tell us a little bit about your journey into your profession and bridging these really necessary intersections of therapeutic style, trauma-informed care for QT LGBT individuals?
I appreciate that. I'm going to be taking notes. I hope that's okay.
Yes, please.
Okay. So yeah, I think historically as like a poor working class person, and definitely as a gender nonconforming Black person being raised by a vehemently racist white mother and a survival of childhood abuse, physical and emotional, I think I was already prepped to do work, and that I also needed to do healing work. When I think about it, I'm like, yeah, like poor folks, like we need jobs, right? So I was like, okay, good, like social work, I could get a job and I could stay employed. And I think that that was a really big impetus. And I was just like, oh, I can be gender nonconforming and queer and out in a professional way, right? Because this was early 2000s when we talked about queer folks and trans folks very differently then. So I was really fortunate in that I got really connected to the crisis folks in my high school and ended up going to a therapist through a mentor turned parent. And so I think also having those influences was like, oh, people kind of do this healing work for a living. And I was, but in a way, like I had a therapist when I was 16, 17 years old who told me that she loved me. And at that time, that really like kept me alive, right? Like I graduated high school with a 1.7 GPA, which I don't even think is legal anymore. So just like having those really, those really like beginnings or introductions to the work is important for me to lift up. After that, I again was really fortunate. I didn't think any of this stuff through. I just kind of, but doing a lot of work in the New York City area, after getting my master's with queer and trans folks with mental illness, elders, youth, and in that space, having to negotiate a lot of toxic work environments in nonprofit settings. And I didn't know any better because I was like a first generation everything, right? So I'm just like, oh, doesn't everybody get yelled at when they go to work? Or, like I just didn't know, but I just knew that at some point I had to leave, right? So it was really powerful work. I really appreciated, but I had to go because it was being run by like white folks and men, and they were being very toxic. And so I was like, I know, I'll run away to the South and get a PhD. I don't know, like that happened. So yeah, I started testosterone, and then 2 seconds later I was down here in the South without knowing anybody, and it was like, okay. So so yeah, I'll never do that again. I don't know who I thought I was. But again, I think just being in these spaces, whether it's the academic industrial complex or nonprofits, just having a lot of meaningful connections with people on the ground, especially being politicized and transformed in the South, right? Like in the North, I really engaged in a lot of respectability work. Like I was like, oh, I'm gonna be the light skinned person who like makes it in my family or something, right? Right. And then coming to the South and recognizing that there's this whole other way of being in the world, and especially having more mindfulness, being introduced to like just collectivists work, collectives in general, right? Like I had no idea.
Right, we met through Cackalack Thunder, so yes, that was part of my schooling as well, like collective work.
Totally. Even though I never did I never performed a gig. I was more like a groupie. But yeah. No, but that was a really powerful thing because, yeah, to think that that work could be sustained for as long as y'all had it going, without any formal financial backing in particular, while holding each other up. Yeah, totally transformative. So yeah, I think that that's, and then a lot of my research in the academy had to do with mentorship and resiliency and efficacy, leadership efficacy of queer students, Black and brown students. It does feel like it was a windier road, but I very much feel like my ancestors who brought me to the South, I feel very much aligned in where I am and doing the work that I am, and I'm just grateful to be able to do it. So yeah, basically 2 years ago, I opened up a private practice, and that happened because I was just like, oh, in organizing, we're all like toxic and mistreating each other and replicating, state violence. And I was just like, there has to be a different way. And I think that doing this work on a clinical level allowed me to kind of bring that full circle.
Awesome.
So yeah, I never tell that story, so thank you.
And being so transparent. So this is a time, we're day 14 into the COVID-19 pandemic. There's a lot of increased levels of anxiety and fear, isolation and depression, hopelessness that folks, especially QPOC, BIPOC, QT, LGB populations are experiencing. And we're often the populations that have been unserved and underserved. So can you tell us a little bit about trauma-informed practices during this time? Maybe trauma-informed practices that have helped you along your journey, and like where to start. Just say like where to start.
Yeah. One of the things that I think most about is how our people have always found ways to sustain ourselves and each other outside of the state, right? Because so I don't know. So, it's always amazing that I see all these people, even this YouTube channel like popping up, and I was like, whoa, people are so amazing. Also, I'm just being very clear with myself that this is not in time to become like a totally different person, right? Like, I'm just like being very clear, or trying to get that, to discern what it is that, what is within my control, right? Because I think,
right. So
so
like,
that, no, I'm listening.
maybe like routine or structure or even no structure and just complete rest right now. Like these things are within our means of accessibility and autonomy right now. You get to decide
Totally.
what day is going to feel like and look like. And you're allowed to feel all of your feelings. Every single one of them is completely valid, day to day, with or without the coronavirus pandemic.
Totally.
I really wanted to also talk about how you're integrating body, mind, and spirit practices for yourself. And I think that that's, yeah, just one question for you there. Yeah. How are you integrating body, mind, spirit practices during this time?
Right. So yeah, and I think if I were to be helpful, I think limiting what our media looks like.
Mhm.
Um, I do think keeping small promises to ourselves every day, like one small promise, right? Like I've just, if I were to give examples from my own practices, I mean, I definitely work to designate a workspace for myself. I've been on this natural hair care journey or whatever. And then so I'm just like, I'm making sure that like that gets care every day. Um, so just some examples um, of things that are within my control. So I really do a lot of my work you using dialectical behavioral therapy. And what I like about DBT is the premise of dialectics, right? Like we're like, how do we meet this time of incredible uncertainty, right? And a lot of my folks are facing, people have lost their jobs, et cetera, et cetera. I recognize that I'm not in that position because I do get to do this work. But what I love about dialectical behavioral therapy is that it's even Marshall Lemahan, white lady.
Great.
Yeah, because I think what it allows for, yeah, it's a curriculum. That's skill based that looks at um, distress tolerance, um, emotional regulation, and interpersonal effectiveness. And like I said, it has mindfulness all throughout.
Just after the emotional regulation and the mindfulness.
Yeah, I think what DBT offers is really powerful in that it recognizes that there's literally parts of our brain, right? The decision making, rational thought is not talking to our more like emotion brain, right? Like what people call the lizard brain, like they're not even talking to each other, right? So it just so it's just like all this, like, I don't know, all the processing that we love to do as queers, just like, maybe that's like not the best approach right now. And really talks about how we can bring our physiology down, right? Recognizing that these emotions through an evolutionary process have action urges associated with these things, right? Like, so when we are scared, we run the fuck away, right? Like that's by design. So working to rationalize is not going to work in those moments, right? So excuse me, moving with that level of fear is not always the most effective thing, right? So how can we borrow rational mind, right? So I do think, right, thinking about what it is that within our control, what do we actually know about a situation, and how when we felt these kinds of ways before could be helpful in bringing us back to what people are calling like wise mind. So I do a lot of that. I do a lot of because I do a lot of asking people, whether it's like through body scan or somatic practices in general, just getting real with the sensations, right? Because we feel these feelings and they manifest as sensations in our bodies. And a lot of times we want to assign, our brain wants to tell us a story, right? To keep us safe. And if we can do our best to check the facts or figure out different ways to not behave as if you are under crisis, right? Like our brains are do such an amazing job of keeping us safe, and right, whether it's gonna fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, right? They do such a good, but but we could also trick it, right? Like one of the for example, one of the exercises is like open hands and half smile. Like we could trick our brains that we're actually happy, and if we engage something with radical acceptance and open hands, then we're not guarding our internal organs, right? Which is what we would do if we were really in crisis, right? So it is a scary time, and right now in this moment I'm talking to joy. you know so between grounding and other kinds of practices, that's kind of like what I've been doing. And then also what are people's practices around like working towards a change process that's like, okay, I had those, um, you know, fight, flight, freeze. I did a lot of shit while I had to survive, right? So how do I forgive myself?
Totally.
Or
Yeah.
so is that a practice going to the river? We could still go outside, right? Can you put something in the river and say a little thing to your previous selves? Thank you for surviving. I no longer need this, right? Like so practices like that, just to give examples.
I think that's a really good point. Is that so many of us, especially BIPOC, QPOC, BLGT communities, have often been on autopilot in survival,
Mm,
and that we need to really recognize that that was a necessity in those times, but that
hmm.
those kinds of that's my cat, sorry, that those kinds of coping mechanisms can also turn into what mainstream culture has called toxic behaviors, and so
Mm,
basically like try to be as mindful and as peaceful with yourself as possible, and really understand that those things were a necessity at that time, and they are no
yes,
longer needed, and they no longer serve you, and we're moving into this very new space right now, this very
totally.
that we're all getting to create. And so, I really do feel like as long as people are really going in and doing that work, call it shadow work, whatever you want,
Hmm.
really,
Hmm.
forgiveness starts with yourself, right? And then we can kind of work outer workings in that way. So, thanks for sharing that. And I just am wondering too, like, how are you personally being called to action or rest at this time, like for yourself and for your community? Are you, especially with your practice as a counselor?
Totally. Sometimes not so great, right? Or like so in terms of coping, right? Like not always great. And so I think that that's also a personal call. Is like if that compassion and self-compassion boosts immunity, that seems like a good time at that time. So I just want to also like not fake the funk, right? Because I also thought like by being a healer that I had to like wear clogs and drink tea and but I'm like, I'm from New Jersey. I curse. Like I'm working on listening. And anyways, so continuing that self work. But the dialectic is people are trying their best, and we could always do more. And just holding that gray space.
Yeah.
So, um,
Are you being called to see clientele through telecommunications? Are you, uh, like rest?
yeah.
What does your self care and community output kind of look like for you
Mhm.
during this time?
So I've been seeing my clients, mostly Black and Brown folks, first gen folks, immigrant folks, in a third on a sliding scale or free forever.
Mhm.
And then, um, yeah, so I switched my practice over to be 100% remote last week. Um, so when I think, so that's a lot of people all at once, and I'm kind of used to that, but it's a different element just being on the internets, right? Um, so I'm doing that work, but in addition to that work, I'm also like an uncle and TT, and that's doing deep care work in my community. That's always been something that feels like life work for me.
Awesome.
So I think so, making sure that my people have what they need. I'm really lucky to live in a part of Durham that there's like queer and trans family members, chosen family of mine that live down the street, and a land-based Black and Brown community land project called Ursi down the street. Yeah.
I miss
So
this home so much.
I know, right? I know people are really doing it, and we're so lucky. And so, yeah, it's cool to be connected to those people. Thinking about mutual aid, whether that's just like I'm gonna send you this Marco Polo, or we're gonna get together some of this monies, or you know what I mean. So figuring out within my capacity. so my partner and I we always have a giving budget, but we, during this time revamped it and thinking about how can we allocate the money. And I will say that people in positions of privilege and power, depending, it's like, it does feel important for me, as a fawning person, as a people pleasing person in my own recovery, that I'd be very clear about what it is that I have to give, and unapologetic when I have to reschedule. Like I hit 5 clients last night, and my 6th one, which I don't usually do, I was just like, I'm gonna have to get at you this weekend because I just don't have it to give. And I think a lot of times, I don't know if you've noticed, and I think in movement work and healing work, yeah, like the idea that we don't put our own oxygen masks on first
Yeah, it's
feels.
very necessary, and that is something that I'm also trying to convey through these talk stories, and through this channel, and
Yeah,
just echoing again, like Angela Davis. I mean, she was saying that movement work in the height of her time, would have looked and been sustained very differently if we would have had the tools of self-care, right? Audre Lorde, like the master into the master's house, right? Like, but and this is part of it, because we really need to start rooting and planting seeds of hopefulness and self-care, because when things like this happen, and this is a large global crisis, your coping skills are valid, right, at this time.
totally.
But there should also be, at that same junction, a place of autonomy and safety and space in order for you to keep moving forward, like keep moving forward no matter your pace. I think that that's really important, to like start talking,
Mm,
really start rooting in. And this is what a lifestyle change looks like, is right now
mm-hmm.
we are at this pause, and it is a very, for me, I am rooted in my divine connections. And so I will say and talk about it like this, that this is a very divine intervention that's happening for me personally right now. But for lots of others, it's just a pause. It is a wonderful pause in order to, um, rest, rest deeply, and then start really considering motivating, activating, initiating
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
now. So I was wondering too, who are your biggest influences in self-care or mindfulness practices that have really helped you ground your energy?
Yeah, I really appreciate you, lifting all of those things up. Um, and these are the things that disability justice folks have been telling us since forever, right?
Yes.
So really trying to, yeah, have their insights inform my movements, right? Like disability, me and Mingus, I'm thinking of.
Yeah,
Um, I also am such a fan of. Have you heard of the Nap Ministry, folks?
nap time
I don't
ministry.
know. Yeah, yeah. I'm like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Um, so, like, we have to reclaim, outside of capitalism, right? I think that, actually I heard Kara Page and, uh, Caitlin Breedlove. Do you remember? That's how we met at that song thing too. Like
Yes, yes, yes.
10 years ago, we met. Yeah, and they just had their own podcast session, being cute together, um, and really lifting up, the legacies of like Southern organizing traditions as something that's just like that was more relational, that was more like, that there was always time to have those those kinds of, exchanges, right, with people. Um, so I do think about, Adrienne Marie Brown's, emergent strategy as an offering about like, the small is all, and there's that we don't have to plug away at these deliverables when there's a conversation that, right, that like is that only we can have. So I do think, so I lean on the Healing Justice podcast folks are doing dope work. I lean on my very elementary training with bold folks and that somatic work. I have busted out my Joe, just to engage in those kinds of physical practices that remind us that we always have power and we can wield that effectively and responsibly. So yeah, and I have to say, my clients are a huge source of inspiration because they're out here slaying the game. Like they're out here really trying to live and thrive. And I'm just, that inspiration makes me, like show up, right? Like recognizing that showing up is the work, that I don't have to, that sure, it helps that I have some practice and some analysis and some information about how to do this work, and seeing value in my own just presence, right? And I don't know, that's been very healing for me. So I would say, in terms of self-care, I would say shout out to my clients because they're incredible source of inspiration and support.
Yeah, I think that's so important. Thank you for, mentioning all of these really wonderful and lively and inspiring people. And I think that it also is very important that we're, right now it is a time of survival, but we are also able to create space for thrival, in this time.
Totally.
So important right now, and it's very necessary because, again, this is a very new this is moving forward. It will not be the old normal because the old normal wasn't working. And so
totally
start thinking about, I think for the longest time, in my youth in the South, we're not going to be in this survival mode anymore. You are still a survivor, and you were like captain, but you are also allowed to thrive. Allowing people to really understand, like, oh yeah, I'm gonna thrive. I'm gonna thrive in this. So we're kind of coming to a close. Would you suggest, in terms of somatic therapies or healings for our people right now?
Oh boy. Yeah. I love your reflections. They always make me think like, oh yeah. Just about thriving also. And just the kind of maybe the survivor's guilt that people feel, and how then we will be compelled to act from those places. And I always really resented like the idea of possibility models. And I was just like, yeah, I'm going to be a 37-year-old whole ass trans person, Black trans person in the South, and it matters that I garden. You know what I mean? It matters that like I get outside once a day, and one of the things that I've been leaning on is a running practice that I developed years ago, right? Like that matters. And that doesn't mean that I don't like Netflix and chill or fall apart or gross, but it matters that also in that time that I'm also thriving, right?
Yes.
And especially in thinking about like, just post HB2 here in the South, post, all Amendment 1, it just, when the money came into the South in a way that we haven't seen, I do feel like we moved away from a lot of the ways that sustained us, that we're now coming back to. So when you ask that question, I'm just like, yeah, we're gonna Sankofa the shit out of some stuff, right? like, like, like we've always been in the dirt, right? So like, our people have always been like growing food and growing medicines, right? So like,
Yes, yeah,
we don't have to do anything new here, and we don't have to do anything with perfection, right? We could just try.
yeah.
So I do think that like, if you have something growing and you want to know the name of it or have a conversation with it, you know, my friend Sophia always talks about like her plant friend, their plant friends, and yeah, like that kind of shit. It matters. It might feel uncomfortable, but it's also, we got to check ourselves and be like, well, why does like, why does all this shit that the other ways that we harm ourselves feel so regular, but like talking to our inner child feels hokey? Like, you know what I mean? We have to like really trouble that a little.
Yeah, try to reframe it all. And, I love that we have been able to continue this conversation over the years, because years ago, you were teaching at Guilford and you had created a space for Bayard Rustin. And
Mm,
do you remember this? You had a panel, healers. And actually, I remember I was working at an acupuncture clinic then, and you had me on there. And
yeah.
we were talking about this very same thing then. And that was like 10 years ago, maybe.
Right.
Love that we're picking back up. We have new frameworks, we have new models, and we have new ways that we're integrating with each other and within this space. And really, one of my favorite things about you and getting to know you over the years is that you've really done a lot of homework on yourself, and you've held yourself accountable, and you've understood that it's a challenge to receive care that is truly affirming. And in your soul search, you've helped to create those unique spaces where resiliency can be found and affirmed and fostered.
Mm,
And your education and higher education, and as a passionate teacher, has really served you well in your social work. And like, I just really want to like give you a shout out, because I think for the youth that are watching this at home, they're really looking for those passionate and life affirming spaces and building blocks to autonomy during this time, especially in a time of mandated stay at home quarantines.
mm,
Just want to give you, and everyone else also that I've been having talk story with.
mm-hmm.
I love us. I just love and so yeah, we're coming to a close, but in the near future, maybe we can have you back on and talk more about some somatic healing for QPOC, BIPOC, GLBT folks. And if you want, we can, name your place of business and your contact info when this gets up on YouTube, and yeah, continue the conversation there. But
Thank you so much, Joanne. Thanks for lifting me up and the work. I mean, I just can't believe the collaboration. It's just so important. Totally. And thank you for your work in general. I'm just grateful.
appreciate you. Okay, Parker. Well, it was great having you on here, and peace.
Peace.